Hello everyone, I'm Shweta and I'm in Internet Law Minds. Today we are going to discuss the topic analysis of the concept of delegated legislation. So let's start with the introduction of the topic. So we all know the Constitution of India empowers legislature to make laws for the country. And one of the significant function of our legislative is that to frame policy and make rules so that there can be good conduct in our country. And obviously, such powers cannot be conferred on other institutions, right? But keeping in mind various multifarious activities of a welfare state, it is not possible for the legislature to perform all the functions. Okay, and in such situation, the delegated legislation comes into picture. So, delegated legislature is one of the essential elements, and it of administration, and it whereby the executive has to perform certain legislative functions. However, it also has certain risks like legislature very often overburden and may unduly exceed the limits of delegation. Like it may not lay down any policy, may declare any of its policy as vague, and can also may set down any guidelines for the executive, thereby conferring wide discretion to the executive to change or modify any policy framed by it, right? So, therefore, we even though legislature can delegate some of its function, it must not lose its control completely over such functions. So, we are going to discuss the criticism, the act, the case, and the article in which Constitution of India confers this delegated legislation to our executives. Let's start with our topic with first explaining the meaning of it. So, delegated legislation, sometimes referred to as secondary legislation or subordinate legislation or subsidiary legislation, is a process by which the executive authority gives power by primary legislation to make laws in order to implement and administer the requirements of that primary legislation. Such law is the law made by a person or body other than the legislature but with the legislature's authority. Legislation by any statutory authority or local or other body other than the legislature but under the authority of the competent legislature is called delegated legislation. It is legislation made by a person or body other than Parliament. Parliament thereby, through primary legislation, enables others to make law and rules through a process of delegated legislation. Now, let me help you all in understanding the meaning. It's too complicated, so let me clear it out for you all. So, delegated legislation serves the purpose of allowing the government to alter a law without having waited for a new act of parliament to be enacted. So, delegated legislation can also be used to make technical modifications to the law, such as punishments under certain act at rare conditions. So it is a type of law that allows individuals or bodies to create detailed regulations under a specific act of the parliament. Thus, it is known as subordinate or secondary legislation or subsidiary legislation. Now, the legislature gives individuals or bodies such as government ministers, local authorities, or corporations the authority to make laws. So, these are your executives. It gives power to your executive to make laws. These laws are known as delegated legislation. The purpose behind this legislation is to empower the government to deal with socio-economic challenges quickly. And we can also take an example of this delegated legislation in India. Um, we can take the example of environment protection legislation of 1986, and this legislation gave the central government the power to adopt laws to implement the legislation. And in 1986, the central government enacted the environment protection rules, to exercise these rights. So, this is the meaning of delegated legislation, to give power to our executive to make certain laws in emergency situation or in challenging situations. Now, what is the need of delegated legislation? We all see that there has been criticism about it, and executive have given so much power that they can call any law vague any time. So this cannot be right every time, right? So the process of delegated legislations sometimes enables the government to make a law without having to wait for a new act of the parliament to be passed. So the process of passing the any act in the parliament is way too long. We have to get the majority, and then we have to get it signed by our president, and president can hold the act, and there's a way too long procedure for it. So what delegated legislation do, it empowers authority to modify or alter sanctions under a given statute or make technical changes relating to a law. And it also plays a very important role in the process of making of law, as there is more delegated legislation each year than there are acts of parliament. So we, like I explained already, that the process of making of act takes a very long time. So it is very important. In addition, delegated legislation has the same legal standing as the act of the parliament from which it was created. It cannot be called lesser than that, an act passed by the parliament. So we'll be discussing now certain points for proving this, that why is there the need of delegated legislation. Starting with the first point, delegated legislation reduces the burden of already overburdened legislature. This point is very crisp and clear, that it actually reduces the overburdened legislature. Second, it allows the law to be made by those who have the required knowledge and experience. Now, if we take the example of authorities and officers, they have studied a lot, they know the basic roots of the country. So if they are making the law, they have the knowledge and the experience more than the parliament members. So it is beneficial for the country also. Third is, the process of delegated legislation also plays a significant role in an emergency situation. As we all know, sometimes there are challenging situations and we need to make quick response to those situations. So it is a process where we can make decisions in certain emergency situations. And finally, fourth point is, delegated legislation often covers those situations which have not been anticipated by the parliament during the time of enacting legislation. So this point is very important, that sometimes parliament also misses some acts, and it does not cover all the situations. So in that area, this delegated legislation come, and they make laws for certain situations which are not covered by our parliament. Next, we'll discuss the delegated legislation position under Constitution of India. So there is a case, DS Garewal versus the state of Punjab and another, which was held on 11 December 1958. Now the Constitution of India, we all know, gives powers to the legislature to delegate its functions to other authorities, to frame the policies, to carry out the laws made by it, and further. In the case of D.S. Garewal versus State of Punjab, what the Supreme Court said, the Supreme Court held that the Article 312 of the Constitution of India deals with the powers of delegated legislation. And Justice K. N. Vanchu observed that there is nothing in the words of Article 312 which takes away the usual power of delegation which ordinarily resides in the legislature. And the most important point, the phrase Parliament may by law provide. In Article 312, it is written and should not be interpreted to mean that there is no scope for delegation in law made under Article 312. According to the England law, enables the Parliament to delegate any amount of powers without any limitation. On the other hand, in America, like India also, the Congress can delegate only some of its functions. Thus, it does not have unlimited or uncontrolled powers. India allows for delegated legislation, but in a defined and controlled manner with certain restrictions, which also help us. Moving further, we are going to discuss the criticism of delegated legislation. So, it is argued that delegated legislation enables authority other than the legislation to make and amend laws, and it thus results in overlapping of functions. It it is against the spirit of democracy as too much delegated legislation is made by unelected people. So we all know that in democracy we choose people and they make laws for us. So it is at some point un it is at some point not favoring the democracy. Now, delegated legislation subject to less parliamentary scrutiny than primary legislation, and thus Parliament has a lack of control over delegated legislation. We all know these are executives, and this can lead to inconsistencies in laws. The next point for the criticism can be that the delegated legislation has the potential to be used in ways which Parliament had not anticipated, and when it confirmed the power through the act of the Parliament. And the delegated legislation generally suffers from a lack of publicity. And since the laws made by a statutory authority not notified to the public or not notified in the official gazette of India, on the other hand, the laws of the parliament are widely published in the official gazette of India. The reason behind the lack of publicity is the large extent of legislation that is being delegated. And there has also been concern expressed that too much law is made through delegated legislation. Now, moving to the end, the end we can conclude that the delegated legislation is important in the wake of some critical situations, emergency situations, and the rise in the number of legislation and technicalities involved. But at the same time, with the rise in delegated legislation, the need to control it also arises because with the increase in it also increases the power of the chance of the abuse of power. The judicial control, apart from the legislative and procedural control, is a way how the delegation of power can be controlled. So, thus, the delegated legislation can be questioned on the grounds of substantive ultra-virus and on the ground of the unconstitutionality of the Parent Act and the delegated legislation. The latter can also be challenged on the ground of its being unreasonable and arbitrary in nature. Thank you, and this was all the description and detailing about the delegated legislation. Thank you.